Hello and welcome back to English 2. As we've been looking at our Notice and Note signpost, today we're going to be looking at words of the wiser. But before we go there, let's review what the signposts that we've already learned about are. First, we learned about contrasts and contradictions. When you're reading and a character says or does something that's opposite or contradicts what he's been saying or doing all along, you should stop and ask yourself, why is the character doing that? The answer could help you make a prediction or make an inference about the plot and conflict. The next signpost that we looked at, that we studied, was our aha moment. When you're reading and suddenly a character realizes, understands, or finally figures something out, you should stop and ask yourself, how might this change things? If the character figured out a problem, you probably just learned something about the conflict. If the character understood a life lesson, you probably just learned the theme. And yesterday we learned about tough questions. When you're reading and the character asks himself a really tough question or a difficult question, you should stop and ask yourself, what does this question make me wonder about? The answers will tell you about the conflict and may give you ideas about what will happen later in the text. Today, we're going to be looking at a new signpost called Words of the Wiser. And so when we think about what that might mean, when I was about your age and my mom was always giving me advice, sometimes I would listen and sometimes I didn't. But my dad and my mom would always tell me to always tell the truth. And so I have taken that bit of advice and have taken it with me everywhere I've ever gone. And so when we think about in a text, when an author gives life advice, gives some advice that is to that main character, we should stop and ask ourselves, what is that life lesson and how might it affect the character? Whatever that lesson is, you've probably found a theme for the story. Now, before we get too involved in this, let's think about this. The definition says that it's usually someone older, but it doesn't have to be. It's anytime advice is given to the character that sounds very wise. And guys, you know the difference between somebody giving you advice at your age that you probably shouldn't listen to and those that you should listen to. So really think about that as we're reading. So today we're going to read an excerpt from Writing Freedom. Writing Freedom is about a young girl named Charlotte who lives during the mid-1800s. Her parents her parents are dead and she lives in an orphanage. She loves horses and she's been working with horses in this orphanage. And so we're going to learn more about Charlotte in this text. And Charlotte is going to get some advice from some very wise people. And we're going to look at that advice and we're going to ask ourselves, what is the life lesson and how will it affect the character? And the character in this story is Charlotte. So your teacher should have given you a copy of the text and you'll have it in front of you. So if you will follow along as I read, and we will look at this scene where she's working with an older and wiser adult, and his name is Vern, and she's talking about escaping from this orphanage, and Justice is the horse that they're working with. So again, follow along as I read, and we will listen for that wise advice, and then we'll ask ourselves that anchor question. What is the life lesson, and how might it affect the character? Thanks, Vern. I wish I could stay with you and work with the horses, but I'd be in the kitchen, and I'd be missing Justice and fretting because I wouldn't get to see Charity's fowl or help you name it. I know, Miss Charlotte, said Vern. You got to do what your heart tells you. I won't ever forget you, said Charlotte. I guess I'm not likely to forget you, Miss Charlotte. I'm going to stop here in this scene in which an older and wiser character has offered advice to the main character. The advice I'm hearing Vern give Charlotte is, you got to do what your heart tells you. When authors create such a scene, you need to stop and ask yourself, how might this advice help the character? How might it affect the character? Whatever that lesson is, you've probably found a theme for the story. So at this moment, the words may help her muster the courage to take the risk of running. And later, Well, we'll have to see if they come back to her, if those words come back to her later in the story, and if they will help her again. So as I keep reading, we're going to find out. So again, take your text and follow along as I read. When you hear an older or wiser person give Charlotte advice, I want you to write a WW in the margin of your text, and that will help us identify those words from the wiser. So follow along as I read. Here were 6 strong horses waiting for her commands, her tugs on the reins, to tell them which way to go. She yelled, "Haw!" and "Gee!" to get them to bear left and right, like she did when she was riding one horse or driving 2. She wished Hayward could see her, and Vern would have just let her get out of that wagon, would never have let her get out of that wagon until she figured out the turns. Just like when he taught her to ride. He kept putting her back on Freedom, her horse, after each fall, saying, "Every time you fall, you learn something new about your horse. You learn what not to do next time." Here's another important place to stop, because I've noticed another place where a wiser character has offered the main character some advice. Vern has told Charlotte something about what not to do the next time. Now remember the question we need to ask ourselves? How might this advice affect the character? I want you to think about that, and in your margin, I want you to think about how this advice may affect Charlotte. Once you've written your thoughts in the margin, turn to your neighbor and y'all discuss what you've been talking about, and we'll come back together. All right, let's regroup. Here are some of the thoughts that I heard as I was walking around. Since she's having difficulty with the horse, maybe this advice will make her think about the things that she needs to do different. It's a pretty good thought there. This problem she is having with the horse, she's mad that it's not doing what she wants it to do. Maybe she will think back to when she was not doing what others wanted her to do. Let's keep reading and see if there are any other moments like these. The story has continued, and now Charlotte is a good stagecoach driver. But on this day, someone from her past wants to ride on her stagecoach, and that upsets her. Ebenezer, the man who taught her to drive a 6-horse stagecoach, sees that she's upset, and he says, "What are you blabbering about? The mail's got to go through, same as them passengers." Ebenezer puts his hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Now listen, don't you pay them passengers no mind. You are what you are, and what you are is a fine horseman, and the best coachman I ever saw. You remember that. Under the circumstances, there ain't nothing left for you to do but your job. So get to it." Charlotte looked square at Ebenezer. Ebenezer looked square back at Charlotte and said, "You're the coachman, you're in charge, so load 'em up." Well, here we are at the end of this scene, and I've seen another Words of the Wiser signpost. I want to see if you can find this one on your own. What does Ebenezer tell Charlotte she might remember and hold on to for good advice for the rest of her life? So I want you to think about that. Jot it down, jot down what you think it means, and then I want you to turn and talk with your reading partner to discuss what lesson you found and what you think it means. That was some really smart thinking that you offered about Vern's advice. Let's look at some of the things that I heard when I was walking around. You are what you are. You're in charge. Ain't nothing left for you to do but your job. That's some great advice that Ebenezer gave to Charlotte. But how might this advice affect the character? So I want you to remember that you've got to not just identify the signpost. You have to identify that anchor question and answer that anchor question. So let's take a minute, and I want you to think about how that advice is going to affect Charlotte. So You do that for a minute and then we'll come back together and chat. Great. So you are what you are. So that tells us that we should be ourselves regardless of who's looking or who's watching. And that was some great advice that was given. Ain't nothing left for you to do but your job. That's a big one, right? Because there are going to be things that are coming at us at all times of our life. And if we just remember that we have a job to do and we need to do that job regardless of what is being thrown at us. So those are some great thoughts that we can apply to our lives that's bigger than just what we've read in this text. So today we learned about our words of the wiser, anchor, text, signpost, or anchor, post, signpost, anchor, you know what I'm trying to say. Words of the wiser, signpost. So let's do a quick review. When you're reading and a character who's probably older and lots wiser takes the main character aside and gives them some serious advice, you should stop and ask yourself, what is the life lesson and how might it affect the character? Whatever that lesson is, you probably just found the theme for the story. When you're taking that map assessment, these are the ways that those will show up. What is the central idea or theme of the passage? Which of the following quotes from the passage is evidence of the central theme? Which of the following quotes is an example of how the theme recurs or is developed in the text? And then choose the statement that best captures the underlying theme of blank. All of these map assessment questions can be answered when you look back at those anchor questions for each of these signposts. And the one for the words of the wiser is, what is the life lesson and how might it affect the character? So tonight, when you go home and you're reading your independent reading novel or book, I want you to think about these signposts that we've been looking at this week. You've got the weekend to think about all of those different signposts and those anchor questions. Your teacher has a handout for you to complete, and you can take that paper home with you, and you can remind yourself as you're reading as you're reading over the weekend and really practice these signposts. When we come back next week, I'm going to give you some lessons on a couple more, and then we have some videos that we're going to watch that will help anchor those signposts in your brain and really help you hold on to those. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, and until next time.